I've been asking the question, what is life in the 21st century? When scientists can manipulate and even create life, and synthetic biology is a thing. When technology can create artificial life, and when some things seem to be neither dead nor alive. Famously, we learned during the COVID pandemic that a virus is one of those things that can't be defined as either living or non-living. And features we used to think of as signs of life, such as a beating heart or breathing, are no longer so definitive. So, for the last 9 years or so, I've been having a relationship with this small rock. Here it is. I didn't so much find it on the beach as it found me. It seemed to be sitting up on top of all the others so that I couldn't miss it. It's bigger than a heart, smaller than a head, small enough to hold in my hand, but heavy enough to call a rock. It may seem strange, but it was exactly what I'd been looking for, even though I didn't know it. That was the beginning of a long partnership. I have a small collection of rocks, all of which are pretty unremarkable, except for some reason I've picked them up and kept them. Here's another one. I believe this one's an iron sulfide nodule. I really like this one because it's very different from other rocks. It's very smooth, very dense and compact, and it seems far too heavy for its size. And this one, a pebble really rather than a rock, was part of an artwork. Like the others, it found me. It was one of a number of 100 stones which were covered in gold leaf by an artist and distributed on Eastbourne beaches for people to find. I've no idea how many were actually found in the end, but a bit like my flint, this one stood out among all the hundreds of thousands of pebbles on the beach. I couldn't miss it. So I picked this one up and I've kept it ever since. Lyle Watson, in his book The Secret Life of Inanimate Objects, calls objects such as my rocks notions. A notion is an inanimate object which need have no intrinsic value or practical utility, but which nevertheless demands attention and exercises power over those people to whom it appeals. It's a thing with meaning, a mind thing, something of consequence which inspires thought, and once chosen, a circuit is completed which provides a flow of energy that gives a notion its power. Now, whatever you may think of that idea, there's no doubt that these stones have inspired thought and have led me to ask some questions, the most fundamental one being, in the beginning, why did some clusters of molecules become this thing we call life, while others remained inanimate? And anyway, what is life? What is the spark of life? And where does the spark come from? The chance encounter with a dead frog reminds me of the connection between electricity and life, and the work of Luigi Galvani, who experimented with the effects of electricity on dead tissue, famously making dead frogs' legs kick in response to electrical charge. At that time, the presence of a heartbeat always used to be a clear indication of life or death. Now, of course, we're used to the use of defibrillators to restart a heart, and being able to breathe independently is no longer a prerequisite of life, with ventilators used to keep people alive. No chance of resuscitation here, though. I think we can safely say that my frog is definitely, permanently dead. But maybe my rock is not dead. Maybe it just appears to have no life. Some years ago, I visited artist Andy Holden's exhibition, Laws of Motion in a Cartoon Landscape, in which the artist explored ideas about the laws of physics as seen in cartoons, a place where it seems like anything might be possible, but not everything is. Through the exhibition, Holden suggested the possibility that maybe there is no such thing as an inanimate object. This theory seemed to me to present interesting possibilities. So I set about trying to activate my rock. I started off with some simple experiments. Let's just try planting some pebbles and see if they'll grow, I thought. I used some pea shingle because I thought the association with peas might help inspire them to grow. I thought I'll just keep it basic and see what happens. Maybe all that's needed is a little bit of TLC. Rocks don't normally get that sort of attention because nobody thinks about giving it to them. But maybe that's all they need, just a little bit of looking after. Pots, soil, water, and I thought I'd try the alternative blotting paper in a jar method as well because that always worked at school with broad beans. Now, people don't need soil to grow plants, or even sunlight for that matter. Perhaps future humans will think we're mad to continue to bury seeds in the mud to try and get them to grow. Gradually, my experiments became more scientific, more serious, more desperate. A nourishing solution fed through a drip. An electrical charge, like that from a defibrillator. But no, still no success. My experiments with growing stones began to feel a bit improbable. Maybe I was being impatient. Let's leave that there for a moment. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Selfish Gene, describes how he thinks life began on Earth. In the beginning, he says, was simplicity. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is satisfying because it shows us a way in which simplicity could change into complexity, how unordered atoms could group themselves into ever more complex patterns until they ended up manufacturing people. Starting with survival of the stable. A stable thing is a collection of atoms that is permanent enough to deserve a name. It's why bubbles are round, because this is a stable configuration for thin films filled with gas. And salt crystals are cubes, because this is a stable way of packing sodium and chloride ions together. The earliest form of natural selection was simply a selection of stable forms and a rejection of unstable ones. In other words, if a cluster of molecules wasn't stable, then after a short time it would simply cease to exist. Meanwhile, back in the lab, steadfast and focused, I carried on with my experiments, determined to overcome the prejudice built up over millennia that decreed that rocks should remain non-life. Why should some groups of molecules become that thing we call life, while others don't, especially if it's only a question of passing the stability test? Now, scientists constantly, deliberately rearrange not only molecules to make new chemicals and new materials, but even alter DNA to make new life forms. In the 1950s, scientists Stanley Miller and Harold Urey famously carried out an experiment, known inventively as the Miller-Urey experiment. They tried to imitate the chemical conditions which they believed might have been present on the young Earth to create the setting for life to begin. So they put simple substances in a flask: water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen, and supplied a source of energy such as might have also been present, for example, ultraviolet light or electrical sparks. After a few weeks of this, something interesting was usually found in the flask. A weak brown soup containing a large number of molecules more complex than the ones originally put in. In particular, amino acids are found, the building blocks of proteins, which in turn are the building blocks of life. Animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a spirit or a soul. Believers in animism potentially perceive all things, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather, human handiwork, perhaps even words, as animated and alive. It's said to describe the most common foundational thread of Indigenous peoples' spiritual or supernatural perspectives. There are many anthropological theories about animist cultures, but what seems indisputable is that animism promoted an active and respectful relationship between humans and their environment. For our early ancestors, all matter was alive. In contrast, today, it seems that the opposite feels true, with the belief among many that humans take a rightful place at the centre of the world order. The one thing I do seem to have learned during all of these years of partnership with my rock is the complexity of the many interconnected systems which form the worlds we live in and govern everything we do. For example, the unarguable connections between rocks and life. To start with, it seemed to me that in this complex world, my rock was literally a solid base on which I could anchor my thoughts. As Dawkins says, in the beginning was simplicity. Before anything else existed on planet Earth, there was rock. But now, of course, I realise that's just too simple. Yes, of course, rock existed before life, but life, or at least the remnants of life, also make rock. And now I understand that before my flint was a rock, it was alive. It was formed during a complex chemical process in the chalk seas millions of years ago. Silica from the decomposing skeletons of sea creatures became part of the accumulating chalk sediment settling on the seabed. Certain processes were enabled in that potent mix of water and chemicals released by decomposing organic matter, eventually to form a precipitate which collected in the burrows and tunnels made by sea creatures in the soft sediment, and eventually formed my flint. So maybe now my rock just needs reawakening, reactivating in some way. Maybe it already is active, but just very, very slow. And after all, if Miller and Urey could create new amino acids in a few weeks using only the technology available in 1952, surely now, in 2022, anything is possible. But I freely admit, I do seem to have become a bit fixated on my rock for all these years. It has become all of those cliches, an old friend, unfinished business, a bit of an obsession. I've fed and watered, nurtured, hoped and prayed, And, well, yes, you're right. Maybe I've taken things a little too far.